שלום, ברוכים הבאים לפסטיבל דוק אביב ה-22. אנחנו שמחים לארח בפסטיבל את דניאל רוהר, במאי הסרט פעם היו אחים, רובי רוברטסון והבנד. אורך השיחה היא חצי שעה, ואנחנו מזמינים אתכם להשאיר שאלות באזור של ה-Q&A בכל שלב, לא באזור של הצ'אט. דוק אביב מודים לשגרירות קנדה על התמיכה בסרט, אני אבידל ליבני. Welcome to the 22nd Dok Aviv Film Festival. We're honored to have Daniel Rohrer, the filmmaker of Once Were Brothers, Robbie Robertson and the band with us today. The webinar will last 30 minutes. We invite you to leave your questions in the Q&A section at any time. And Dok Aviv wishes to thank the Embassy of Canada for their support. Hi, Daniel.
Hi.
Thanks a lot for joining us from Toronto. And I heard it's not your first time in Dok Aviv.
Well, it's not my first time in Dok Aviv. I've been to the festival before. A couple of years ago, I was visiting relatives in Tel Aviv, and the festival was happening, and there were all of these exciting industry events, and I was wanting to be a filmmaker. And so, of course, I didn't have enough money to buy a pass or a badge. And so instead, I just snuck into one of the industry events and was able to stand in the back and listen on to a panel or a pitch forum or something like this. But Dok Aviv has always been an important festival on my radar, and I'm just sad that finally you guys accept one of my films to play at the festival, but I can't come to Tel Aviv and be with my family and show the film. So I'm a little bummed out about that, but I'm really grateful that we could do this via Zoom anyway.
Okay, great. Thank you. And maybe next year or next time or next film, you'll be here.
I hope so.
My body. Yeah. I envy you, and I believe a lot of people are envious to you because of all people, you made a film about the band and Robbie Robertson. How did you become the man to do this film?
Well, it was one of these amazing things where I read Robbie's book, his memoir came out, and I just devoured it. I thought it was so incredible. This was like 2016, and I decided in my head that I had to be the filmmaker to work on this documentary. So I put together all of this work on spec, and I tried to pitch it to whoever would listen. And I assumed because Robbie's Canadian, it would be a Canadian production. And what ended up happening after I did all this work and hustled and worked very hard is that Robbie and the production company ended up working with a different filmmaker to make the movie. And that was obviously tremendously disappointing. But I realized that, it wasn't meant to be, I guess. But what ended up transpiring is that Robbie didn't get on with that filmmaker, their relationship. They didn't really have chemistry. They needed someone else. And I was standing there ready to jump in and do this film. And Robbie and I met, and we hit it off. And we got along really well. And I flew down to LA, and it was, I think we really were on the same wavelength, the same beat. And that's really where you needed to be.
Mm-hmm. And was it easy to raise funds, money to make a film about Robbie Robertson, or was it difficult?
I don't think it's easy to raise funds about any film. I think this was a pain in the ass to raise the money for, but that thankfully wasn't my job. I just focused on making the movie, and I just figured if I can get us a rough cut and work hard enough to produce a rough cut that's really good, we'll be able to raise the money to finish the movie. And that's sort of what happened. But the whole thing is steeped in this unknowingness and the anxiety of whether or not you'll be able to raise the money. But it ended up that we were able to do it. So that was tremendous.
Mm-hmm. And how was it working with him? Was it hard? Did he want to decide everything or everything?
Sometimes it was easygoing. Sometimes he's a pain in the ass. It really varies. Robbie's a perfectionist. He really wants everything to be perfect. And if it's not as good as it can be, why are you doing it? What's the point? And that's the approach and the ethos he brings to the table. And I have a very similar approach in my work. I want everything to be as perfect as can be. And I want to make the best film I possibly can with the resources that I have. But Robbie doesn't care about resources. He doesn't care about the budget. He just cares about having the best film he can possibly have. And I think he appreciated how hard I worked to deliver on that.
Mm-hmm. And was he involved in the decisions of how to tell the story, or did he say, just do it your way?
Well, he was involved insofar as that his book was really the inspiration, the spiritual inspiration for the movie. But beyond that, not really. I mean, he wasn't interested. He's got a million things on the go. He's doing albums and this project and that project. And so the film was really just a way, just another thing he had on his slate, another project he had. And I would just go do the interviews, start editing. We wouldn't really be in touch. I'd ask his manager for stuff. And then it got to the point where we had to show him a far enough along rough cut. And once we showed him that, he was like, okay, this is pretty good. We're cooking with gas. And I think he really liked what we put together.
Mm-hmm. And the film basically tells his story.
Yeah.
And obviously that's a big decision, right? Because, you can tell the story from all kind of perspectives. Were you thinking of doing something else on the way?
Well, not really, because at the end of the day, the film I was hired to make was the story of the band through Robbie's perspective. Mm-hmm. And I always find it interesting when critics and people comment on this, and it's an interesting question to bring up, but people often lose sight of the fact that I don't have agency over what I'm hired to do. My mandate is to make a film about Robbie Robertson, and within that, there are certain tributaries and directions I can travel to, but largely speaking, the broad mandate was a film about the band through the eyes of Robbie Robertson. And that's obviously different than a film about the band through the eyes of Levon or Rick or Richard or Garth. But this is the film I was hired to make, and that's really how it came together. So with that mandate in mind, that's sort of how I proceeded. But the perspectives and opinions of the other guys in the group were, of course, very relevant and important to my work, and they were never far from my thoughts.
Mm-hmm. We have a question here by one of the attendees in the Q&A. Why there's no reference in the film to the death of Rick Danko and Richard Manuel?
Excellent question. So that was probably the hardest part of the movie, what to do about this. And, when you're finishing a movie, you just want to land the plane. You want to just end the movie and go out on a celebratory note. And the logical place for that scene to talk about that, the stories that you just brought up, were in like the last 10 minutes of the movie. And I had a cut of the film where we had Richard's death in there and Rick's death in there for probably 6 months, but it was just obtuse and it really didn't fit in. And it occurred to me that Richard's suicide could have been its own film. And to just have it in there in like 30 seconds at the end of the movie, to me was, it wasn't respectful and it wasn't appropriate. Mm-hmm. So we thought that it was best just to not overtly mention it and instead pay tribute to the fallen members of the band during the outro when we're listening to The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down. But it was obviously a very challenging thing to maneuver as the filmmaker and editor.
Mm-hmm. Now, there is a very big movie already done about the band, The Last Waltz, by Martin Scorsese. And we'll talk about him shortly, but is it like a big shadow to make a film like you did, having the Last Waltz behind you or over there?
It wasn't really for me, because The Last Waltz is a totally different thing. That's more of a film about a concert, as opposed to a biographical film. And to me, what makes The Last Waltz so extraordinary are the concerts and the performances, which Scorsese shot so brilliantly. But the interluding interview parts of that movie are less interesting to me. Like, I think those are okay, but the concerts are like banging. And that's what I really love about that film. But I never thought that my film was in competition with that film. I would never thought that I was following in the lineage of that film. I think they go very well together. They complement each other very well. But at the end of the day, this film is a completely different, totally different thing. And I think it can stand on its own very easily and contrast with The Last Waltz very effectively.
Mm-hmm. And you met Martin Scorsese, obviously.
I did meet Martin Scorsese on a couple of occasions.
And interviewed him for your film. Mm-hmm. So maybe you can tell us a bit about him and how his reaction was to you personally and to your
film.
Before
I answer that question, this is being recorded. Is this Q&A going to end up on YouTube? Because if it is, I have to watch what I say.
I'm sorry?
Is this interview going to end up on YouTube? Because if it is, I have to give you a different version
I think it's going to be shown. I don't know if it's on YouTube, but
Okay.
in Doc Aviv, I don't know. Yeah, I'll find out for you.
I'll speak delicately.
Yeah.
So when we were going to shoot our interview with Scorsese, we did this interesting thing where we arranged for 3 interviews to be shot that day, and we shot all 3 of them in his office, in his studio. Whenever you see Scorsese in a movie, he's always in a little cinema, and that's in his office. He has his own movie theater, screening room in the office. And so we were doing David Geffen, Martin Scorsese, and then Bruce Springsteen on the same day. And it's like no pressure, but those are obviously very important people. And what ended up happening is that Geffen came in, we shot his interview, it was fine. Scorsese was just supposed to show up at 1, and we were going to do his interview, but he was like an hour and a half late. So he comes in at like 2:15. Bruce Springsteen's supposed to come at 3. Bruce has to be out at 3:45 because he's on Broadway that night, so he's got a hard out. And so Scorsese comes, I'm taken in to meet him, and I was like, you know, trying to just do small talk, and he seemed very frazzled and all over the place. And I was like, you know, Mr. Scorsese, maybe it'd be better like if we just switch the interviews and film with Mr. Springsteen first, and we can film yours after. And in my head, I'm trying to be helpful and respectful. And he thought that was incredibly disrespectful, that I would try and change, as if like I would change the interview time. I'm in his office, like this is in his house, and I'm disrespecting him in his place. And I was like, I didn't really know what I did wrong, but he got really mad. And then he said he was going to cancel the interview, and he said he was going to do it another time. And then he kept telling me, he was like, I have to go and I have to go edit my movie. I'm editing this film. You know, editing's like an opera. Do you understand? Editing's like an opera. And he kept saying editing's like an opera, and I didn't know what that meant. And I tried to be very reverential and apologize, but he just like bounced out and never came back. And before I could fling myself out a window to end it all, Bruce Springsteen sort of walked out of the elevator, and I did an interview with him. He's a lovely guy, really down to earth, very, very sweet man. And it was lovely to get to, you know, get that interview because he was amazing in the movie. And he's a poet. Everything he says is poetic. He's like a soundbite machine. And Scorsese was a little bit more difficult.
And was it hard to get Bruce Springsteen to speak in this film, to be interviewed?
Not really. The way it works is you can get people in the movie if they like the guy the movie's about. So Bruce Springsteen did this as a favor to Robbie because he loves Robbie and wants to help Robbie, and knows that if he shows up for 40 minutes, it'll be a big, helpful thing for Robbie's life or whatever, or this film. So that's how you get Eric Clapton and Bruce Springsteen. Robbie's manager emails their manager, and it's like, hey, we're doing this thing for Robbie. Can Clapton be part of it? And and that's sort of how it happened. So there were some people that we couldn't get that weren't interested, and there were others that were like, yeah, whenever, we'll do it.
Okay. You read the book, but what did you learn during this film that you didn't know about the period of the film and about the story and about Robbie Robertson?
Well, what I took away from making this film was less about what I learned about like Woodstock and the band and Bob Dylan, and more about how I think it forced me to reframe my own life and how I view my own life and think about time and space. In a weird way, that sounds very philosophical, but it's sort of this cerebral, weird exercise. It's very meta of being a young man, making a film about an old man when he's a young man. And that whole thing of like making a film about Robbie when he was a young guy through the lens of how he is now as an old guy, it really forced me to realize like, oh, life is quick and it goes by fast, but it's also long. And Robbie's 45 years older than I am. Like one day I'm going to be 50 and 60 and 70. And what do I want to do to fill up those years, and what's important? And what Robbie's life really illustrates is that, you know, being bold and just like going for broke and leaving nothing behind is a really good recipe to live a kick-ass life. And it's something that I really try and carry forward. And, you know, that's what Robbie was. He was this young streetwise kid who had vision for his life, and he wanted to do something great. And I'm equally ambitious, and I want to do great things too. And it's just about hauling ass and working hard and thrusting yourself into your art form And I think it's that similar energy that really allowed Robbie and I to connect.
Were there things you wanted to be in the film that you couldn't get to? People you wanted to interview you couldn't get to, or scenes you wanted?
Well, to the last question we got, I think that the story about Richard and Rick's death was, really hard to cut that out of the movie. I wanted to get Neil Young in the movie because he's a Toronto guy, but we couldn't get Neil. And same, I wanted to get Joni because Robbie and Joni are very close, but she was unwell, Joni Mitchell. But otherwise, no, I mean, there's 15 Bob Dylan songs in this movie. Who gets to put 15 Bob Dylan songs in their movie? It's like, it's kind of a dream. So there's not too much that I would change or alter. We kind of did it.
And how big is the band for Canadian people? Are they that big because they're Canadian?
Well, yeah, like in Canada, we sort of worship our own. Like if someone's like a Canadian act, we know that they're Canadian. But also there's this inferiority complex where the mark of success is when a Canadian act goes to America and gets famous there, as if like, Canada's like the junior B league and America's like the professional league. So we love, the band's very big. I grew up with the band's music. My dad would always have the band playing and that was just an important part of our experience for sure.
Can you tell us a bit about Robbie's wife, their relation, and how much was she involved in the film?
Dominique, I mean, she gave us a phenomenal interview. Dominique Robertson is a fabulous, fantastic, really, really incredible woman. And what I didn't know when I went to interview her is that after she moved to LA with her family and the band was finished, she went back to school and she became a counselor and a therapist working with patients who are dealing with substance abuse and addiction, mental health issues. And I just thought that was such an amazing, incredible thing, that she took her experience from the band and ended up spending her life working with people suffering from chemical addiction. And so when I interviewed her, she had such a clinical knowledge of substance abuse and mental health issues and alcoholism that gave the film this incredible clinical knowledge almost. And between her interview and Eric Clapton's interview, I was so grateful that we could talk about the challenges of substance abuse and the difficulties of chemical addiction. Her and Robbie are no longer married, but they're very close friends. They really love each other, and they have all these beautiful grandchildren and a beautiful family. I was last with her last year in Toronto, and it was so wonderful to see her again. And I was just so grateful that she was able to be so amazing in the movie.
Seems like family-wise, his life weren't the ordinary rock and roll life, right? You show that in the film. Is that true, or is that the way they want it to be?
Say that again.
I was saying that their family life, like you showed in the film, are very un-rock and roll, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, the rock and roll lifestyle is not really compatible with having a family because family is all about structure. Your kids have to go to school. They have to eat 3 times a day. You have to, they have tutors and after-school activities and whatever kids do. And rock and roll, you're on the road. Your schedule's up in the air. All you know is that you have to be on stage, wherever at the specific time, and you play your show and you bounce out. But it's very hard to reconcile being a rock star and a successful musician with wanting to have the stability of a family. And I think that's something that a lot of artists can appreciate. And it was difficult for Dominique, certainly.
And we have another question here. How do you see the way Americans treated the fact that the band are actually Canadian?
Well, Americans that's a good question. How do Americans, I don't know, Americans don't know that Canada exists. Like America, think of Canada as like this one monolithic thing. Like if I asked an American, some Joe Schmo to describe Canada, they'd be like, yeah, lots of polar bears. It's winter for 11 months of the year. You get to school on your dog sled. It's like this weird caricature version of Canada. And, you know, it's obviously absurd, but I don't think Americans have an appreciation for who's Canadian, who's not. I only think it's Canadians with our little inferiority complex that really thinks about who is Canadian, who's a successful Canadian, and who's gone out and done it. But I don't know. I recently, interestingly enough to this question, someone asked me to do an interview about the politics surrounding the night they drove Old Dixie Down. And in this era of sort of reframing history through a contemporary lens and taking down statues of Confederate soldiers or generals, how this song, The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down, will continue to have relevance. And I immediately declined to participate in that because I don't need to be commenting on anything to do with that subject in the context of this movie. But that's really the awareness. I don't think there's anything else that Americans are too aware of when it comes to Robbie being Canadian or anything like that.
Now, there is still another living member of the band, and he is not interviewed in the film. Is that a decision? Did you want to interview him and he didn't want to participate?
Well, I did interview him and he did participate. There's not really like, I've had to figure out ways to frame this over the last year since I've been doing press for the movie, but there's not really a way to say it other than the fact that Garth is so old that it's not really possible to interview him.
Wow.
He's just, he is impressive in his physical appearance because he looks like he's 120. And I say that, I think that sounds disrespectful, but I don't mean it to. It was a wild experience getting to go see Garth. He's living in his own world, and I had to go and see him on Hudsonian time. But his interview in the movie would not have worked, unfortunately. But we did interview him.
Okay, because I was thinking, you probably saw the film about Kurt Cobain.
Yeah.
And people said, how come Dave Grohl is not in the film?
Yeah.
How can you make a movie about Kurt Cobain without interviewing Dave Grohl? So I was, as a director, I said, you can, if that's part of your story, if that's how you want to tell the story. So I was thinking maybe that was a decision that you took as a director not to do it.
No, it wasn't. In the context of Montage of Heck, Brett Morgan made a decision to make a very intimate film with only the 5 or 6 people closest to Kurt. And Dave Grohl is in like every movie ever, so he just didn't think it was necessary. And I think it was a very bold decision because that film is amazing without Dave Grohl in it.
Yeah, he did, by the way, he was here in Doc of Eve a few years ago with that film. And he did say that he did, in the end, he also interviewed Grohl in the end, but decided not to put him in the film because it just didn't work for him with, like you said, the story he wants to tell. So it's always interesting for me also, to hear about how you go your way as a director and do your thing, which is definitely, I can see that in this film, that you did go in a certain path. And I'm sure that there were a lot of critics we were saying, but you did not tell the story of this and that, or what about this song, or what about this guy?
Yeah, but at the end of the day, there's nothing that can be done about that. It's just people will have their opinions. I'm making this movie, and there's 15 executive producers, 4 producers, and they're all chirping into my ear, giving me their thoughts and opinions. And at a certain time, you just have to tune it out and make your movie. And, thankfully the vision worked for everybody. But, it's a horribly collaborative process. And I say that, it's hard. You want it to be your vision. Other people have their ideas, but you just have to make the thing. And this film pissed off a lot of people who love Levon Helm and think that he got the short end of the stick. And it's like, okay, go read Levon's book and watch his movie because it's a great movie and it's a great book. But this is Robbie's movie, and that's that.
Mm-hmm. What is he doing today, Robbie Robertson? He's 77, right? 77.
Yeah. Making music, staying isolated, trying not to get COVID. I haven't talked to him in a while, but he's hanging in there. He's all good.
And us being Israelis, him discovering that he's half Jewish, did this change anything in his spiritual way or the way he defines himself?
Well, I'm glad you asked about that, because yes and no. Like what that whole story about Robbie discovering his Jewishness really speaks to is sort of like the genetic makeup of what it is to be a Jew. Like, here's a guy who was raised with a single mom, who was raised with Christmas every year, who'd had no awareness of Jewishness, but there was something in him that was indescribable that he didn't understand. And it was like this ambition and this vision and this work ethic to schlep and wanting to do something. And it was this Jewishness that was like laying dormant. And it was when he met his uncles, his Jewish uncles in Toronto, that sort of clicked. And now when I spend time with Robbie, he seems very Jewish. Like he's an old curmudgeon-y Jew. Like you know, the way he says oy vey and stuff, it's like it's hereditary. I don't know. It's just this weird thing where he seems much more Jewish than indigenous in an interpersonal level. Mm-hmm. It's a funny thing that's tough to quantify.
Mm-hmm. Does his book ends with the band, or does he write about his life after the band as well?
It pretty much ends with the band, I think. Mm-hmm. It's like a 40-year memoir. Like the book ends when he's like 35. It's kind of incredible.
Mm-hmm. And he did not want this film maybe to add some more about his career after?
I mean, there were people who certainly wanted to, a lot of people who wanted to, but I didn't want to because I wasn't interested in that. What's interesting is his time with the band, and the rest is kind of like not as for me, the music's great, but what's really at the heart of this is this story of these 5 guys and the tragedy of this love story. These 5 guys who loved each other and tried to make this incredible thing together, and how it didn't work out. That's what the film is. So you know, I really want to focus on that, and going off into what Robbie did in the 80s was less interesting to me.
Can I ask what you're doing these days as a film director?
Well, I'm developing. I mean, it's tough to shoot a movie without being able to fly, but now I'm going to be able to travel. I'm going to Vienna next week for work for a film project, and unfortunately I have to be a bit tight-lipped about what that's about, but I have 5 or 6 projects at various iterations of development, and the one that's in production right now, we were shooting in Turkey, we were just shooting in Beirut in Lebanon, and I'm going to be in Austria for that project.
Mm-hmm. And do you want to make, or do you have plans to make other grand music films about grand Canadian musicians or whatever?
Well, Canadian musicians, not really. Just like, if it's a musician that interests me, maybe. But I just want to make stuff that's fascinating, and I just want to make money and make films, and that's what I'm interested in doing. Because when the film came out and it was this big success, everyone was like, what do you want to do next? What do you want to do next? And I was like, I have no idea. And so I had to spend 6 months being depressed and trying to figure my life out, it seemed. And I just came to this understanding that, I just want to make films and make things that are interesting to me. So I'm just trying to follow that inspiration. And a couple of the projects I'm working on are in that strike zone and are really quite compelling for me. But more in the human rights, international politics, political space that I'm equally interested in.
Okay, great. So there's a marking that our time is up. And thank you very much for this, the time you gave us for the great film. And hope to meet you again on person next year.
Thank you, I appreciate that. And I think the Shiners in Haifa, who are my cousins, are listening to this chat. And I can't wait to see you guys hopefully next year when it's safe to travel. I wish I could have been in Tel Aviv for this in person, but thank you for listening now.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.